want to welcome you. This is a historical event for us, particularly for me, because this is our first one. And in the process, I ascertained that one of the biggest problems that guys with PTSD have is, and I'm not qualified to make any medical judgment or spiritual judgment, I'm just a common, ordinary guy. But in my opinion, what the guys need more is somebody to talk to who has been there, who's been in war and understands what it feels like to be shot at, to be surrounded by explosives and so on and so forth. And in hearing stories from other veterans of what they've been through and how they've dealt with it, how they've helped others deal with it, I think maybe that will be helpful to a lot of veterans. And there's a longer story involved in how I came up with the concept of spiritual healing. I like to say it's a search for God's help in dealing with the wounds of combat. Well, it's whoever the higher power is that you believe in. For me, that's God. So I talk about God. But, you know, I'm not trying to offend anybody. So that's what we're doing. I had this concept a year ago. I started the planning last year, about this time. So that's what we're all about. We have to let veterans know that we're here and we're willing to help. There are lots of veterans organizations that touch on spiritual healing, but that's not the only thing they do. They do other things, so that might be a couple hours. All we're doing is spiritual healing. We have to be able to reach down and tell our innermost secrets in public, in this group. Because of the way that this came about, I feel like it's my mission from God. God has truly put this thing together for me.
I was gonna say, I appreciate your effort and trying to put this together. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. It's why I get up every morning. I'm going to do it until I'm dismissed.
Again, why I got involved. Of course, Tom. I got to meet Tom a couple years ago. He's a pretty persuasive guy, number one. But I know how passionate he is about this. And when we sat down, and you'll get to meet Nina and so on, but they are two very influential people in my life, coming to Greensburg, working in Greensburg as a high school principal. And I know what his goals are for this. I have some things that I want to discuss about resiliency and so on, and what his goals are for it, and the spiritual side of things. But I think what we want from you also, more than anything out this weekend, first to get to know you, number one, but also that feedback that he's talking about, because I know where he wants this to be and where we need to be, but your feedback's going to be so important on this. And that's where when we thought about doing something like this, and again, with me being Christian, but I had a platoons full of soldiers that from inner city DC that were some Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus, and it was new to me. I'm from rural Pennsylvania. It was an eye-opener, but I had to somehow relate and figure that out, and that's where I learned to, even attend some of those different things for them. I'm still that. I grew up Brethren, now I'm Lutheran. My mother's Catholic, so we're kind of all over the place, but that's okay. But I think we all, we're all for the same person, the same goal. So I think this program, what we want to do here, and again, I'm going to talk about resiliency at some point here tonight or tomorrow morning, because I think that's very important, and we do a lot of resiliency training with our soldiers right now, because they're dealing with a lot of emotional issues, whether it be family, whether it be military, whether it be work-related or so on. And when they hit that wall, how do we overcome and break through? A couple things. I'm going back to our mission and what our purpose is. And I look at, starting off where he has welcome to Veterans Angels, I'm looking at this right now before I even get to resiliency. And then back to our mission. I really think that I really didn't sit there and focus on this like we've looked at it many times, but I'm sitting there going through it as you're talking too, because it's like, connect, Veterans Angels seek to help combat veterans connect. I'm looking at these words, connect with spiritual healing. And however that spiritual healing is for certain people, whatever works for anybody. But I believe that spiritual healing is what kind of keeps us motivated and keeps us resilient in times. And when I sit there and think about, when we go back to our spiritual healing, and I think about faith and the faith that I had while I was deployed, and even before I was deployed, but I think it reinforced it for me. And when I came home, I think that supported my resiliency for when I came home. And I think your faith, as you talked about, supporting your own resiliency.
But when Tom asked me to be part of his board, Veteran Angels board, I was really honored. I'm thinking, how am I going to inspire you when I have done nothing to parallel your life's experience? So what I do, I'm a statistics person, so I looked up the statistics for the Iraq and Afghanistan war. And 1 in 5 veterans have PTSD, and 20% of the suicides in the country are veterans. So it is very difficult to let go of the traumatic past because it's part of us, and part of you have been lost on that battlefield. What we tend to forget is that we have to come to terms with our loss. What is that loss? It's the loss of who you were. So you have to come to terms with it, and we have to have the courage to grieve what is lost. I believe that you have to have the courage to grieve. And when you grieve, I firmly believe that God walks beside you. He is there for you, but you have to believe He is there. I had this little Italian grandmother who survived many things in life, including one where she was deaf, probably in her young 20s or 30s. She loved her garden, and I remember her hotbeds and going down, and she would lift it up and you'd smell basil and oregano and parsley, and it was just a wonderful aroma. She had beautiful flower gardens. And the one day when I went to visit, it was early spring, and we went outside to look at the daffodils. And I saw the daffodils on the ground in the snow. And so as a child, very emotional Italian, I was tearing up. And in her infinite wisdom, she said to me, the daffodils were bent in the snow and resting on the ground, but she said, sometimes the weakest are the hardiest, and they only bend, they don't break. Wow. And they will come back up. I carry my prayer cards in my purse. It's somewhere around here. There are prayer cards in my purse. You know, if I don't go to Mass, I turn on the TV and you know, pray in front of the TV. And guess what? I am a daffodil. I am a daffodil, and I still bend, but I'll never break. I'll never break, and God did hear me. But what I didn't understand is He wasn't going to pick me up. I had to do it myself. And so what I want you to do is, in your darkest hour, look beneath the surface, because you are there, and you will find yourself. Again, it's not going to be the same person, but it's going to be a person of value and a person of purpose and somebody who can really, really give back to the community and to God's earth.
A little bit about my service. I'm RA all the way. I joined the United States Army in 1969. So my attitudes about war were shaped, and I heard, I don't know if, Father, if it was you talking about how we dehumanize people, but I remember the exact instant that I stopped calling Vietnamese gooks. And here comes a 10-ton pulling up, and he's blowing his horn. And I looked over, I'm the guard, right? I looked over, and the guy yelled out the window, hey man, it's a kid in your truck. He's stealing. He jumped out of the truck and started running. And I took my 16 and aimed right at his back. And all I know was the hand of God. I went "Brrrr," like that. And I thought about that years later, how close I came to shooting a 10-year-old boy in his back. And had I done that, would I be where I am now? And those two things had a real impact on me. And it really affected me to a great deal. Yet in hindsight, I thought God had spared me for some reason from committing those horrendous acts of killing somebody, even running them over in a truck. And I know the last thing I would ever remember is that man's face looking up at me, cussing me out if I'd done that, or if I shot that kid in the
I'll
back.
tell you a little bit about myself before I talk. I'm going to talk about depression today. Before I start, by a show of hands, who knows someone that deals with depression? Yeah. I'm a mental health counselor by degree and by profession. When you talk about listening, that's what I do. I listen. I listen to what people say. I also listen to what people don't say. We've talked today about different branches of the service. My name is George Scott. I grew up in Joliet, Illinois. I wrestled I wrestled 8th grade in high school, played football, and I couldn't play basketball. I couldn't make a layup to save my life, but I could always wrestle. So I left Joliet, graduate high school, '89, and I went in the Marine Corps. In the Marine Corps, we were taught if you can't drink all night and run all day, you're not a good Marine. So I mastered one of the two. Guess what it was? The thing is once you start to drink, you never forget how to drink. So when we drink, and even though we stopped, I haven't had a drink since July 5th of 1999, the day I was incarcerated. But I still remember how. But what I do now is I replace that behavior with other behaviors.
Amen.
Okay? By the power of God.
Amen.
And by a vow that I made to myself, I would never let anyone control me like that again. So I went to the Marine Corps, and I had a pretty easy enlistment, except for the times that I inflicted pain upon myself. So I went from PFC up to a sergeant, back to a PFC. 6.5 years. So I ended up getting kicked out of the Marine Corps. I said, well, what am I going to do now? And I started to deal with depression because that's all I ever wanted to be was a Marine. That was it. I didn't want to be a husband, didn't want to be a son, didn't want to be nothing, a pilot, nothing. I wanted to be a Marine. That was it. So I become so upset and judgmental, I attacked that man and his wife. Boot stomp, both of them in the street, and I almost killed them. So they had to sweep them up, medevac them to Loyola up in Chicago. That was Monday, July 5th of '99. That was the last Newport I smoked. That was the last drink I had. And so I was sentenced to 25 years in prison, Illinois Department of Correction. Came back, somehow miraculously my service record book showed up before they were going to sentence me. Got broken down to 10 years. So I did 8.5 years, Class X felony is 85%. So 8.5 years for drinking alcohol, fighting. So yes, you can be healed, you can be delivered. Ask that question for your point. Yeah, you can be delivered and healed from anything. It's difficult to find employment here in Pennsylvania. A lot because of the Sandusky thing up in Penn State. But God has brought me through.
George.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned God a lot. You want to tell them what you said about God the first time I saw you?
Yes, sir. I met Mr. Abraham up in Simplify Odyssey up on the mountain. This was back in June of 17, or June of 18. And General Jones asked us, I can't remember the question he asked us.
He said, we went around the horn, and on the third time going around the horn, he said, tell us something that you're most, that you're not so proud of.
Yes.
That happened.
Yeah. He said, tell us something you're not proud of.
Yeah.
And so everybody went around, oh, I cheated on my wife, I lost a job and this. And I stood up, and I didn't want to say it, but I did. I said, I lost confidence in God. And everybody looked at me like, I was like, you asked. And I had. Because of everything I had gone through, and it was all self-inflicted. There were choices I made, and that's what I try to get my clients to see, that's what I try to get my students to see. We have choices.
Dan was a Marine in Vietnam.
Because of my Marine Corps background, it so happened that the Marine Corps' National Transition Program for its Wounded, Injured, and Ill ended up in Boswell. How could you believe that? Boswell, Pennsylvania. Nothing there but a blinking yellow light. That's Boswell. And it used to be a Boy Scout camp. I'm sure you knew that. And so I got involved with Tom because his mentor, General Neal, four-star General Neal, he and I were lieutenants together. In that battle that Tom just briefly talked about, there were 7 officers that went out, and there were only 2 of us that walked off the hill, Butch and I. And so Butch Neal mentored Tom Jones, who then told me when Tom Jones came to Pennsylvania for me to look him up. And that was back in 1998. And so we've been very, very tight since then. And he was on the board of the Semper Fi Fund, which funded all the Marines who were wounded, injured, and ill, and corpsmen to go to this camp for transitioning. And then this 501(c), Semper Fi Odyssey, became very successful, and they started the Americas Fund underneath it, and now we have soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And because of that, we were now able to go to vet centers. There's 366 vet centers across the United States, and begin to tell the vet centers about our program. And now we're beginning to get veterans, when before it was primarily active duty guys. But the war has really slimmed down, and there's not very many active duty that are wounded anymore. So we're really reaching out to all the veterans. And bear in mind now, we've been at war for 18 years. So although we always think of the World War II as the greatest generation, we think, us Vietnam guys, we think the greatest generation are these guys. And post-traumatic stress disorder. Vietnam guys had PTSD, but we didn't even know the word. We didn't know anything about it. I'm sure Abe had some PTSD, or PTS, maybe no D on the end. I certainly had PTS, but I wouldn't think I had a D on the end. But when you've had this many deployments, you know, there's only so much resiliency. I often think of it, my wife gets poison ivy just by getting near it. I didn't get any poison ivy. I could run around it and I didn't get it. Until a certain time later on in my life, I got poison ivy. And from now I can get it all the time. So it's kind of like you have a resistance to things, but once that resistance goes, then you're in another space. And that's what happens to these guys that have had so many deployments and on and on. My role up there, I'm what's called the senior team leader. I train the team leaders. I lead teams. I've been doing this now for 11 years. I've probably got over 11,000 hours. I've done 59 of these weeks in a row over the past 11 years. So I really have a good idea of what makes up our current warriors.
Thanks for coming, and thanks for input.
Thanks, everybody.
There's a little church down the road. It's called St. Michael's Orthodox Church. It was founded back in the 50s, and I am a charter member. When I was in Vietnam, I used to write all the time to my priest and tell him how things were.
You know, one of the things when we get into meditation, and I think that probably more than anything we could speak about today, that would be a very useful kind of focus of the topic. And I have to thank Tom again for inviting me to do this, because while it started out as something that I didn't quite understand what would be happening here, and I still don't necessarily, between Jen and Anita, who both shared, you know, something very personal regarding, you know, their life's experience, you know, this became something that I wanted to make sure I stayed for through the whole day. Because, you know, when it comes right down to it, while we know that we could go online and we can find all the libraries of the world combined there, and we can find all the most brilliant, charismatic people talking to us about all kinds of wonderful things. The only problem is they're not really with us. They're not real people. They're videos, and we can learn stuff. We can get data from them, but there is something extra special, you know, whether it's Jesus saying wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, or whether us just recognizing that, you know, the universal mind, or however we speak about it, you know, about our common humanity. that it is, people with people. It is, flesh touching flesh. It's eyeball to eyeball kinds of things that makes the difference.
Addressing us.
My pleasure.
We've got P.J. Kelly back here. He's a chiropractor I told you about yesterday. Sounds like it should be a Marine machine gun or something, P.J. Kelly. But he's going to talk to you about, I mentioned yesterday, he's going to talk to you about holistic medicine and alternatives to opioids.
Basically, I opened a wellness center. The wellness center was to give options and things that are less invasive, less addictive to all treatments, not just pain. So we don't just not chiropractic. We have chiropractic, we have acupuncture, we have counselors, we have a Reiki master, we do yoga. So what we try to do is anything that can improve emotionally, physically, spiritually. We want to be there to help these people.